In this episode, we talk about building a solid development process and building teams. Hey fellow developers, my name is Christoph Limpelaer and this is the Scale Your Code Show. The show now has over 20 episodes, and most of those episodes talk about automation, scaling infrastructure, and other challenges that growing apps and companies face. What we haven't really covered yet is something super important. How do you set up your development process for growth, and how do you build a great team? Because having a process that can grow as your team grows, or even the project grows, will make your life much easier in the long run. And if you've ever tried building a team, you already know that this is a tedious and challenging process. That's exactly why I asked Adam Wiggins to join us on the show today. Adam is a co-founder of Heroku, where he was the CTO. He left back in 2013, and he now advises startups in Germany. We'll get to hear more about that in a moment, but first, I want to thank Linux Academy for giving you a 24% discount off of their regular price, which you can get by going to scaleyourcode.com/Linux Academy. This discount gives you access to all of their high-quality certification training and access to their hands-on labs where you practice on real servers. All of this at your convenience and for different skill levels on topics like Linux, AWS, OpenStack, and DevOps. Go to scaleyourcode.com/Linux Academy. And now, let's welcome our guest, Adam. Welcome to Scale Your Code.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you're joining us from Germany, right?
That's right.
Halfway across the world.
Well, it depends on where you are, but for Californians, definitely the other side of the planet.
Right. So for some of y'all coming back to the show, you've probably noticed that we've talked a lot about scaling architecture and infrastructure and talking about different challenges that companies run into running at such a scale from the technical point of view. But today we're going to do things a little bit differently because I feel like it's long overdue. So in this episode, what we're going to talk about more is not only the scaling of the code base itself, so as your application grows in size, how do you manage that development process? And second of all, how do you grow a team? Because when you think about it, the team works on the code base, and then the code base is going to run on your infrastructure. So without those two, you're in a pickle. So they're as important, if not more important, than the actual infrastructure and architecture, which is why I'm really excited to have Adam on the show today to talk a little bit about that. So the first thing we're going to cover in a general sense, and if you want to get more information on it, I'm going to put some links below the video so you can go back to it, because Adam was nice enough to lay it out in a little bit of a book format so you can get more information that way. But it's called the 12-Factor app. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about what inspired it and what it's about?
Sure. Well, the 12-Factor app is a set of first principles for application development, specifically designed to make it maintainable and especially deployable to a lot of different targets, especially cloud targets. And we were inspired to do this a few years back because we'd been working on Heroku for a while. In that process, we had seen tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of applications, actually. And so, of course, that also means seeing the applications break in a lot of different ways. That includes when people go to first deploy and they're trying to get it running, as well as what happens over time as they make changes. And we saw patterns in the kinds of problems that people would have and would write into support about, or we would see this in the usage logs. And we were motivated to pull out that pattern and write about how you can avoid that class of problem. And it was especially notable once we became what we call the polyglot platform, that is to say support for multiple languages, because then we saw patterns that went across language communities. So as one example, the dependency management, as mentioned in, I think, the second or third factor, is basically something every language community kind of figures out on its own. And we saw that, on one hand, say the Python world, it wasn't completely on board with the dependency management. The Ruby world was kind of getting there. The Java world had figured that out a long time ago. And while the tools were different, the solution is kind of always the same. It has this kind of timeless quality. And so we wanted to write that down in a language agnostic way and have that thing to share not only with our users and customers, where we could say, here, build your application this way and avoid some pain, but also just share with the community in general to hopefully kind of slightly improve the state of the art for application development.
When you have a set of rules like this, how do you enforce them, or how do you make sure that your entire team is on board with using them, and how do you make sure that they're actually being used? Do you kind of have a documentation that you keep an eye on, and you double check your app or servers, make sure they're running that way, or is it more of a, you learn about it and then you try to apply it? How does that really transform into reality?
I do think of principles as being something that's different from rules. Naturally, they do, one produces the other. The principle of it's wrong to take someone else's stuff may produce the law of, you'll go to jail if you steal. But a rule is a way to enforce or put into practice a principle. Mm-hmm. So from my point of view, the first place to start is have those principles laid out in a clear way. That's some of the motivation for 12-factor, as well as lots of other software principles that exist in our industry. And then get your team on the same page about it. Be able to say, yes, we want to do things this way because we think it allows us, we think it will give us better velocity, or it makes our jobs easier, or it makes our applications more robust over time. And so once everyone agrees to it, then now you're just talking about a method. You're talking about it as a way you can accomplish this. And I certainly like tools that encode rules, that encode the principles, which usually manifests as certain kinds of constraints or certain kind of rules. Rails is a great example that was very inspirational to me, where it encodes the model view controller principle. And that, of course, comes with restrictions. You can't, for example, access the user's cookies from within a model. And some people might chafe at that restriction, but if you agree with the principle that the pattern encodes, then you should be happy to have that constraint, because it kind of keeps you on the right path. And ideally, a good tool, to paraphrase my partner Orion, a good tool makes the right thing to do also the easiest thing to do. So it shouldn't just be that the tool encodes constraints that stop you from doing things, but they also make it really easy to do things the right way, where right is here is defined by whatever principles your team has decided that it wants to adhere to.
I was just reading a chapter in Clean Code, the book Clean Code. I don't know if you've read it or not, but excuse me, my throat's closing up. It was a chapter talking about vertical spacing, horizontal spacing, naming conventions, and all these different kind of rules that you want to have in place before you get started on a project. And the author was mentioning how they really just had, before they started typing any code, they sat down as a team, and it took about 10 minutes where they just said, you know what, this is how we're going to name things, this is how we're going to space things. These are the rules that we want to have in our code, and that way everybody is on the same page as far as that goes. And it takes just 10 to 15 to 20 minutes in a meeting, all hands-on meeting, and then you're good to go for the rest of the duration of the time, instead of having one person doing it one way and then somebody else doing it the other way and having arguments of, you know what, I don't like reading it this way, or just simple things like that. But they really make a difference in the long term. So I see what you're saying there. So let's get started. What do you say we start with the first factor, which is Codebase? And what does that... What do we need to keep in mind when we're talking about Codebase?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the less controversial or less radical ones. In a way, it's just trying to establish some shared terminology, because you can talk about apps, and you can talk about deploys, and you can talk about code bases. To me, it's just establishing that if you've got 3 developers that are working on an app, and you've got a production deploy and a staging deploy, and maybe there's a test deploy over here. These are all different instances of this application, and they're all probably in slightly different states, but they all share one code base. And so I think, I think that one's pretty obvious, but it establishes this is a term that we're going to use for this thing that unites all of these different separate deploys, and then secondly is going to tie in with when we have a revision control system that's pretty tightly tied to our deploys. Heroku does that, but also most continuous integration tools, things that tie in well with GitHub. it becomes important to say, yes, we have a thing, we have a code base, it's in revision control, it's all coming from the same root branch. You can always resolve every deploy against every other deploy in terms of where it is in that revision control tree. So not such an exciting one, but it's a good place to start because of its simplicity.
Right. And you do mention configuration settings not being in code. Why is that important, and what kinds of config can we have in code? What kinds of config should we store outside of our code, and how should we store it?
Yeah, that one to me seems pretty simple, but it's often confounding for folks. Yeah. To me, config in the sense of I'm using it here boils down to something that is going to be different between each of those deploys. It's going to be commonly different between each of those deploys. What I consider to be an anti-pattern is the approach that early versions of Rails introduced with you've got a config file that has config.yaml or whatever that's got staging, production, development 2, and you often have a profusion of those things. And really what you want to do is be able to just control all of those values independently for each deploy, no matter how many of them there may be. So that's something like, what database are you connecting to? Or is this a dev mode and I should put a special toolbar on the screen for the QA testers that's not going to be there in production? Those are config, and there's usually not that much of it. Even a substantial production applications, you may have 10, 20 keys that are in there, and they don't need to change that often, but they are different between every deploy. That's separate from something like application config, where you're saying I'm configuring the framework to work in a certain way, and that actually you want to be the same across all of your deploys. Okay. So, and you don't want that in the code base, because it just means people are constantly doing check-ins for these little config tweaks that only affect them and their local deploy. And it's just confusing. And then, of course, the fact that very often most of those config values have security credentials in them, database, username, and password, for example. So lots of reasons to keep that out in a separate config store. It's very small, and it can be set per deploy.
And a good check for that is, can you make this repo public? Can you have the configuration files in there? Then you can't make it public, obviously, because then you'd have some issues. But that's a good check for it.
That's a thought experiment I like to do. Yeah, if you're checking in keys that you wouldn't want to share publicly, then you're probably not adhering to that config principle.
The next one covers backing services. And you say treat backing services as attached resources. Are we talking about, for example, if you have something like Redis or Memcached, you want to be able to just pull it out and swap it out with something else at any time? Is that what this section covers?
It is. For me, it's largely about, it may be more clear nowadays, but when we were first authoring this 5 years ago or whatever it was, cloud was still sort of a new area, and these what I call cloud services, so that is to say the Twilios and the New Relics of the world, and of course the Heroku add-ons catalog has got hundreds of these things. You are often composing your application from using many of these services, and it's easy, there seemed to be a tendency to think of, okay, I'm using this, I'm using a service to send email, and that's an external API that I'm calling. But then I've got my local database or my local memcache, and I'm going to treat those as more like embedded in the application in some way. And while it's true that those the Postgres and the memcache are probably more important and more critical to the application, all of them are just services that you're calling through some API. And so the idea there was to treat each of them as a service that can be attached and detached at will. They tend to differ by deploy. And if you get in terms of thinking of, for example, your database as a service, an API service that you can attach and detach at will, that makes certain things very easy, like database upgrades, where you can start up a secondary database that's following your primary database, and while you wait for that to fill in with the data from the primary database, and then you can do a quick hot swap by just switching that one config key, because you think of it as detaching this one resource and attaching this other, rather than the database as being something that's I guess permanently married to the application. So maybe it's just a small kind of philosophical difference, but I find that thinking of it that way really makes it a lot easier to, I guess, take advantage of all the great services that exist in the cloud world.
I always think of that as different Lego pieces, where you can take one Lego and pull it out of it, pop in another one. They all have the same connectors, so they can all fit as blocks into each other. That's kind of the way I visualize that.
I think we even used a sort of a Lego-like kind of puzzle piece thing as some of the in some of the add-ons dashboard or
Yeah,
some of the kind of logo marketing stuff. Because
right.
precisely, if you do it right, it should be that very kind
Mhm.
of plug things together in a clean
Mhm.
way.
All right, after that, let's see, there's build, release, run. I think that's pretty straightforward. Versioning, deploys. Is there anything else that's important to remember between these different stages?
Yeah, I think it's just having a clear process for how you do deploys and making sure that you're not working backwards in the pipeline. And so, at least I spent a few years doing freelancing in the PHP world as well as
Hmm.
Perl and that sort of thing. And it was pretty common in those days to I don't know, just SSH into what was effectively the production server and start changing some code right there on the file system, or even have the application itself. And this is something you see heavily in like WordPress world or whatever, write out files onto the file system under the assumption those are gonna persist, and that's breaking that build, release, run process, where the build process is going to happen starting from the code base. It comes out of revision control cleanly, and then it can go through, be combined with the config, and then go into the production environment. And so having those clean separation, for example, makes continuous integration very easy to do, whereas it's quite hard to do if you're muddling those up.
I remember. I'm trying not to laugh because I'm remembering when I first started doing development, PHP, WordPress specifically, and when I wanted to change a file, my versioning system was file_1.php, file_2.php. Problem with the deploy? Just change the name and push it up with FTP or something.
That's right. Yes, I think a lot of folks have gone through that sort of homegrown versioning system. Nowadays, I think people that start out, particularly in something like the Ruby or Python world, where versioning is just sort of part of the day one stuff that you learn, revision control is part of the day one stuff you learn. They'll never
Mhm.
have the joy of inventing the homegrown revision control system that involves subsequent numbers after the file name.
Right, and now you can just do cap deploy, or you can, if there's a problem with it, you can revert back, and it does all that for you. So it's beautiful, really is.
Yeah,
The next step
yeah.
is processes. Now this one was interesting to me. There's a part where you talk about sticky sessions as being a violation of this rule or principle. What is or why is that a violation?
Yeah, sticky sessions, just to define really quickly, is something where the front end load balancer keeps track of what back end runtime instance. So in Heroku, we would call that the routing mesh and the dyno. Um, and so that subsequent requests from the same users go to the same backend. So if someone's, say, going through a shopping cart on an e-commerce site, each request goes to the same backend, and that allows you to do things in memory. You can store the user's state right in memory. You just make a structure or whatever it is your language allows for, and you just store, here's the stuff that's in their shopping cart, here's what step they are in the process. Of course, the problem with this is that it makes it hard to have a share nothing architecture. So share nothing being one of the components of making a really robust distributed architecture, where you should be able to send a request to whatever backend is able to handle it. And of course, also you see those old sticky session things. For example, those are those annoying websites where you come back after a couple of hours and it's timed you out or it's forgotten about you. And probably what's really happened is that the backend is restarted, or the front end load balancer has forgotten about you because they don't want to keep that many things in memory. So it's not a good system from our point of view on how to build really robust distributed systems. And there's a much better solution, which is you keep that state. State shouldn't go in memory. It shouldn't go in. It shouldn't go in the load balancer. State goes in a place where you store state. A database is a really good example of that, for something that's maybe more transient session data. Maybe you want something like memcache, which I think of as a type of database that just happens to be temporary. So that's the better practice. And again, in the past, it was hard to get a memcache going, for example, or maybe it was hard to add a new table to your database. But in this wonderful new world of cloud services, where we can do that stuff very easily, we can add a memcache with just one command. We can add a new table to our database with minimal effort in our migrations. That's the way to do it. And then that gives you the benefit of having the backend runtime instances, dynos in the case of Heroku, they don't need to persist anything between each request, and that's just a better, more scalable architecture.
I've told you about Linux Academy's great deal that they're offering viewers at scaleyourcode.com/Linux Academy, and now I want to share some of the training courses they have so you can see if it's a good fit for you. Linux Academy's courses are not just for one skill level. Let's take, for example, the Amazon Web Services track. This track starts out with associate level training, where you walk through core concepts for Certified Solutions Architect, Certified Developer, and Certified SysOps Administrator. After that, there is a professional level that covers important concepts on scalability, security, and other topics. That way, you can skip ahead if you already understand basics, or you can take your time if you're just getting started. You can do the same thing for Linux, DevOps, and OpenStack. Get your discount now at scaleyourcode.com/Linux Academy and start off 2016 gaining important skills to take your career to the next level. Go to scaleyourcode.com/Linux Academy. This is a bit of a sidetrack question, but you brought it up by mentioning logging in, where you go to some websites sometimes and it seems like you're logged in forever. I feel like Facebook does this, where I never have to log back in, but other services do time you out after a while. I feel like that's more of a security measure, assuming that's not the reason, or the reason isn't because they forgot about you or something like that. But how do you feel about having a user logged in for that long from a security perspective and privacy perspective? How do you feel about that? I'm just curious.
Sure. I mean, I think that is an application-specific security call. Banks tend to be really aggressive with logging you out of their website, whereas something like a Facebook isn't. Certainly, I think that more or less matches up with my use. I probably would care a lot more about a careless bank session left open than I would about a careless Facebook session left open. So I think it's worth trying to evaluate in the context of what really is the impact to your customer if they leave a session open accidentally on a friend's computer, for example. And that it's tricky to do because, for any given product, take something like Dropbox. Some people use it for pretty mission critical business stuff. Other people use it for photos of their vacation. And so the relative impact of your session accidentally being left open somewhere varies by customer. So
I'm excited to start talking about the team building in just a moment, because just all these different things you have to think about, and that's where the team really comes in, being able to brainstorm and getting different ideas from everyone like that. So I'm really excited about that. But first, we got a few more factors to cover up.
Well, yeah. If you were curious to, I can certainly speak to, now that it's been out in the wild for a few years, I know which of these tend to spark the most interest or maybe the most questions. So we could certainly jump to some of those. For example, the dev prod parity towards the end is a big one that comes up a lot. But yeah, tell me what you want to look at.
Yeah, sure. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, the concept there maybe is more general than some of these other pretty when we talk about logs or process distribution, that sort of thing, those are obviously pretty technical. The dev prod parity is almost a little bit more, gets into that team workflow thing. But the basic idea there is that something that changed in the last 5-10 years in software development is that you didn't have these incredibly long release cycles where there was a lot of layers between the developer writing some code and it eventually being on a production site where people could try it out. And that's a really good thing for the most part. You have teams that deploy multiple times per day. You have a customer that writes in with a bug. You can fix that bug and get it deployed and turn it around to them, and they're blown away by that result. And it makes you fast and agile, and it's very satisfying for the team too. You see your work out there. One catch on this is it means that differences between a development environment and the staging environment, the production environment, are likely to cause problems when you're deploying that often, and you have fewer gates to kind of catch those problems. So one really common one, maybe not so much these days, but at the time 12-Factor was written, was people using SQLite as their local database for development, and then Postgres in production, or maybe even using, say, Postgres or MySQL locally, and let's say they're using MySQL locally and Postgres in production because they personally like the MySQL admin tool, but the operations person that's running the production app says no, Postgres is more robust, whatever. seems like a nice idea, and it seems like an ORM, since it abstracts away 99.9% of what's different about these databases, that should make it possible to do that. And indeed, it is possible, but when those few tiny fractions of a percentage point come up to bite you, they really bite. It's really a problem. And that slows down your ability to deploy with confidence, because now you're worried about these incompatibilities, and that means you're going to do it less often, and then you're going to slow down, and we lose all that benefit of that fast feedback loop. So the concept there is simple. Just make your local environment and make the staging environment match production as closely as possible. Yeah, it's a little bit of extra effort to set up a Postgres or set up a Memcache, but not so much effort these days. And some people take it to what I would consider to be the natural endpoint of that reasoning process, which is to use something like a vagrant image and just say, okay, we're just going to completely remove all possibility of a different operating system. We're working off of these images, and that image is the same one that's going to run in dev and production. You can never have 100% because developers need things in their environment that are actually would be detrimental in production, and vice versa. But you can do everything possible to remove every unnecessary difference, and therefore save yourself a lot of pain and get that agility of fast, frequent deploys.
For those different tools that you do need in development environments, do you just bake that in the image itself? Or once the machine is provisioned, you go into it and you add those tools later on? Does that make a big difference? Or
it's a good question. I personally have not done a ton with this or the vagrant-based development. I've just seen teams do it, and I like the concept. So yeah, I think there you would have to make the choice between either all the tools exist in every environment, you're just choosing which one to bring in. That's probably in some ways the safer thing. But another way to do it would be sort of like mount an extra layer of stuff into one environment or the other. But yeah, I don't have a ton of direct experience with that.
What do you use then to make your environments the same?
Largely, it's just a matter of trying to avoid differences. Like I said, yeah, using a different database. One thing that's really tempting to use is in-memory sessions as a drop-in replacement for Memcache, but they're not quite the same. So again, there I will want to run a Memcache rather than even in the local dev environment where it's completely not really needed. So it's really, for me, it's largely about those services. But I also would be on the lookout for, consider to code smell anywhere there's code in the system that's, if environment equals development, or if environment equals production, or if domain equals rapp.com, that kind of stuff that is conditionals around what environment you're running in. That to me is something to watch out for and be avoided, and try to normalize those out in some way.
How would you go about doing that? I have a few spots where I do something like that in a few of my applications. I'm trying to think of ways that I would get rid of that, but how would you approach that situation?
Sure. Well, it's situation by situation, but I think I mentioned the case of having a little administrative bar that appears maybe for the for testers in your staging environment, and maybe you also want that in the dev environment, but you never want it in production. For me, I would make a Boolean config value that's just basically admin toolbar on or debug toolbar on,
okay.
And if that value is set, and what that means is that if you want to test something in production, you can just temporarily turn that off, because if you feel like that difference is creating a problem, or you can have a state one in staging environment maybe that has that value turned on, and another one that's closer to production, and the first one is for some kind of testing, and the other one is for just a final kind of green thumbs up, let's just take a quick look over the site. Again, it's going to depend a lot on your app and what your needs are, but what I would basically do is start with, do we really need this to be different? No, really, we think we do, but do we really? Let's stop and think hard about that. And then second, if we actually do, then throw in a little config value and try to just really, really limit the scope of it.
What about logs? How should those be handled differently when you are on a development environment versus a production environment?
Yeah, to me, the logs are pretty simple, right? They go to your console in development, and if you use a tool like a Foreman or one of its derivatives, those all interleave together on your screen, maybe color coded or something like that with the process name that it came from, and you can see it all in one place. And probably in a development environment, there's little enough log spam that just scrolling through your terminal is just fine for finding what you need. And then in production, those all get piped to some kind of central location. On Heroku, we have a thing called Logplex does that for you. It's very nice for being able to tail your logs all interleaved in real time. But there's many other systems that do that, including classic stuff like syslog-ng, where you can basically or syslog in general, right? It's just a tool for allowing every piece of the system to be able to just throw its logs out to some logging server and have them all land in one place so they can be aggregated and searchable later.
So you were the CTO of Heroku up until, was it 2013 or so?
That's right. Actually, technically I was only it for 2 years. It's kind of the nature of founders to be generalists and not like being put in a box. And so all three of our founders kind of were in that category of did a lot of different things, wore a lot of different hats. And that was fine in the early days. As we grew and got to a certain size, I think once we were 50 or 60 people and some of the other executives there impressed upon me, it's important. Titles are useful to help people know what you do,
right,
especially new people that come into the company or people that are outside the company. And so I was like, all right, fine, I'll go ahead and take on a title. So and then so I had it for the later part of my experience there. But really, the main thing I did was I was sort of like the leading the product was my role.
So did you? What does that mean more specifically? What did a daily, or what did a day-to-day look like in your life at that point?
Well, there was many points. Part of the fun and challenge of a fast-growing startup is that the job changes every 6 months. So what my job was when we were 10 people hacking away on something, trying to get product market fit, was just quite different, worlds different from what it was like when I was managing a 75-person department where we had a huge customer base, and a lot of revenue, and a lot riding on the continued good operation of the product. That said, the theme that ties through all of it, I would say, is, as I said, is the product work. And to me, I define product work, or product management, as sometimes called, as being an expert in the domain of the customer, knowing what your users and customers need, what problem you're solving for them, what their lives are like, and what's important to them, and how you can help them be successful in whatever it is they're using your product to do. So for a company that's making like a consumer product, the product people will tend to not necessarily be so technical because they're more focused on, the parts that face the user, and the user is not technical. When you're making a product for developers, obviously whoever is leading that product needs to be a developer themselves, needs to come from that background, and needs to very much be deep in the technical world of things. So for me, my day-to-day always involved understanding what problems people had and how we could make those things better, and then sort of growing and organizing the team around our goals, what we wanted to accomplish in our roadmap, what things we were trying to build and ship to users, and get the team together and figure out how we could make that come to pass.
How do you understand what users really want? Is it more of a data mining process where you just look at a bunch of logs and you get information from that, or is it more one-on-one, you're emailing customers and getting feedback from them face to face or even by email? How does that work?
Yeah, all it's basically black magic. Not quite, but there is a lot of it that's intuition and just a gut instinct and a sense for it that you just develop, I guess, over time. Something that comes with experience. Have to be data driven for sure, because otherwise, you could get too focused on, say, your loudest, most vocal customers. I've certainly made that mistake, where the people who are writing into support and the people who are writing on Twitter may or may not actually be represent. In fact, they almost certainly are not representative of your whole user base. There's a lot of people who are quieter, maybe because they're just busy.
Sure.
They're busy building their app. They're not. They don't have time to talk about it. So you have to do a lot of things, particularly as you grow. When you're small, it's easy. You go to we would go to RailsConf when we only had a few thousand users. We basically meet half of our user base there and talk to them in person, and they would show us what they were working on with their app and how they were using the product and what problems they were having with it. So that made it easy to do on more of a personal level. You could easily synthesize all that information in your own head, collect all the information, synthesize it. Later, it's got to be with usage statistics. You have to go out of your way to reach out to people and find out, hey, I see you're doing something interesting on the platform. Can we just talk for a little while? And the trick there is always to come to understand not just what's their application and how are they using your product, but also who are they? What's important to them? What do they value? What things are problems for them in their lives? And it may or may not be things that are inside the scope of your product, but having that whole picture of who these folks are that you're trying to help, that you've in fact devoted your life to trying to help, you've got to have a whole picture of that in order to, I think, make the leaps to substantially different products, rather than just doing small iterations or doing small improvements based on, people writing support complaining about they want this feature. Okay, we'll build that feature. That's a very straightforward way. But if you get to know in a deep way as people some representative sample set of your audience, then you can combine that quantitative data, the qualitative data, and a good bit of sort of hunch and black magic, and you throw that all together, and you can bring it together into hopefully some synthesized, holistic new product that you can offer people.
Mm-hmm. Going into more depth as far as prioritization goes, how do you do that when you're more early stage product? You have a few thousand users, you go to a RailsConf, and you've got a bunch of people saying, oh, I wish I had this, and somebody else saying, I wish I had this feature, this feature, this feature, this feature. It's very easy to sit down and say, you know what, we need to build all of these because they're all awesome features, right? But then you spend all your time doing it and nobody ends up using a feature. How do you know which features are going to turn out that way? Or is it just a trial and error, get a good gut feeling, try to align that with the company values? How does that work?
Yeah, there is a lot of trial and error. You do have to combine evidence-driven reasoning with just some instinctive ideas, but ultimately the market is the only test. And for every 5 features you build and ship, assume one of them is going to be really truly useful, and the rest are just kind of mess. And I think that is true no matter what. And you see that also if you watch. Yeah, you see companies that are really great at product. You watch something like Twitter or something like Slack or whatever, and they're pushing out new stuff all the time. And very often, 90% of it seems like a good idea, but in practice it doesn't improve the product that much, and then maybe they trim it away later.
You were laughing when I said that. Is there a specific example that you guys worked on and it turned out to be a pretty bad feature? Or?
I would say we threw away 95% of the things we ever built, and of course I have no way to compare that to other companies other than just ones I've advised for or worked with. But generally speaking, that's how it goes. Yeah, you just can't truly know until you build it and ship it. And that's part of the reason you have to move fast, and you've got to try out prototypes and do MVPs, and then you double down on the stuff that seems to have struck a nerve, and the other stuff you just trim away. But yeah, to answer your original question about prioritization, like in the early days, it's almost pretty simple because you just pick a target user, and it actually can be a real person in some cases, where you say, this person here, we believe they're square in the center of something we can serve, and we're just going to do everything we can to make something they absolutely love. And then you go into that trial and error process. But when you narrow it down to one person, it often gets easier. Later, when you're trying to serve a lot of different demographics with a lot of different needs, it gets much, much harder. And there, you need to do qualitative, and you need to bring in people from lots of different areas in the company to give you their perspective. What the salespeople say they need to close a deal is going to be different from what the support people say that they need in order to stop a problem that a lot of people have, which is going to be different from what the engineer says, something that is possible to build with technology that could be really awesome. And you bring that all together and you combine it with market data and customer interviews and all these other things, and hopefully you come up with here's some things we think have a good probability to succeed. Let's build those and test them out, and then we'll go from there. This
is a pretty good segue into team building and culture building as well. So let's move on to that. First, I will say that we didn't cover all the factors. So like I said, below the interview, if you're watching this on YouTube or listening to it or on scalarco.com, then if you check the mentioned links below, I'll link up the 12-factor site that you can go on, and you can read more of those to get more information that way. So what kind of, you're in Germany now, you're advising different startups. What kinds of startups are you advising?
All kinds. I sort of went on a little rampage there after I left Heroku and wanted to fill in my work time with something that was not such a massive responsibility as starting a new company, and hopefully would let me use maybe some of the things that I learned, some of the hard-gained experience to help other companies. So to name a couple companies I'm advising here, one is Contentful, which is an API-driven content management system. So you can think of it as sort of like in the same category as like a Drupal, but completely focused on API driven. rather than sort of web page driven. They're doing really, really well. I met them when I came a couple of years ago, and I've been helping them out. There's also Clue, which is a really fun one. They do digital reproductive health, so they make apps for Android and iOS that let people with uteruses track their menstrual cycle, and that gives you all kinds of capabilities around understanding when you're fertile, when you're not fertile, you're trying to have a kid, you're trying to not have a kid, you're trying to understand particular health conditions that interact with that, as well as just sort of the lifestyle impact of this biological process. And again, another company that's really blown up now, but they were sort of a tiny little team of 8 or 10, I think, when I first met them. And so that's one of my favorite sizes for a company. And so it was a lot of fun to help them out, especially because it was in this domain I didn't know much about. So yeah, there's two examples, both Berlin companies, and both doing well.
I've seen you post a few links on Twitter and I guess other areas as well, where you say, this company is hiring. Here's the job page you can go to and apply. Hiring is difficult. It's a difficult process. You have to find the right people that match the right culture at the right time. How do you go about, first of all, growing from maybe an 8-person team or even a single person project to start growing and hiring? How does that process work? How do you find the right first hire or the right people to join your team at first?
Yeah, this also is one of those as much art as science things, and also something I've spent a huge portion of my career trying to learn how to do well. The answer is there's a lot of process things you can do to make the hiring process work well. For example, starting with knowing what you want. And I like to really base that around the job description. So one of the first things you want to do when your team starts, let's say you're a couple of founders and you say, we want to hire this first person to join our team, we think we're ready, writing down, here's what the job description is, even before you think about what's the job post going to be, what's the ad going to be that we put up somewhere on Stack Overflow jobs or whatever. But just for ourselves internally, we're going to write a little one-page document that just says, here's what we're looking for. Here's the qualities we want. Here's the things we want them to work on. Here's the things we want this person joining our team to bring to our team. And often you find the process of just trying to write that down is very difficult. And then often you also find one person writes it down, the other person looks at it and says, no, that's not what I was thinking at all. So having a lot of clarity around that is important. It's just one of many sort of process things you can do to help you in that process. But to some degree, it's just something you need to do and get experience with. And if you haven't done it before, getting help from advisors or mentors who can give you their wisdom is probably a good idea.
And the problem with me is I can be really picky when it comes to certain things. How does that translate into hiring? It kind of feels like maybe this is a bad example, but it kind of feels like dating sometimes, where you have to understand that you can't find a absolute perfect fit. There are some certain things that aren't going to be perfectly right, but how do you weigh the pros and cons, especially when it's early stage startup hiring, right? You're not as big of a company. It really matters who's on the team because it's a very small team. How do you write down certain things, like you said earlier, write down certain things you're looking for and you share it with the team that you already have? How does that work?
Yeah, well, again, it's almost an existential question there. Certainly, again, knowing what you're looking for, writing that down, and sharing it with not just your team and all being on the same page about that. In this case, the literal page of where you've written this stuff down, but that goes into the job post so that the people that are coming in know what you are looking for. So you're not, the process of applying for a job is, or usually many jobs, is stressful and difficult.
Yeah.
You want to make it as easy for them as possible to see if they, one, if you're a company that they would want to work for, and two, whether they feel they can fulfill the things that you're looking for. So, but one thing I do like to use, in addition to trying to write a lot of stuff down, here's what we're looking for, here's why we think or here's a list of all the ways that we think this candidate fulfills this list of things we agreed we're looking for. But at the end, I also like to just ask the question of myself and every person on the team who's going to be working with them, who hopefully got a chance to interview or work with them, basically ask the question, how personally excited would you be to work with this person? and I'll ask for 1 to 5 stars, or thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever you want. But like, don't just abstractly tell me, oh, this person seems like a good designer, or they seem like a good front end developer. Tell me, are you super pumped to spend 40 hours a week with this person for the next 2, 3, 4 years, right? And if you put it in that way, often it causes someone to go, oh, well, they seem like they have good skills, but for some reason I'm actually not that excited. Or you actually have the other way around, which is like, well, they do have a couple of gaps in their skills relative to what we said we wanted, but I think they can acquire those skills, and I'm really excited to work with them because just when we talked and worked on the starter project, which is another piece of the hiring process I like to use, we made really good things together. We had really good creative synergy, and so therefore I think they're going to bring a lot to the team.
So the character fit, or the personable fit, is more important than the skill level they're currently at, you would say?
Skills are really important, and I have done the thing before of hiring people that I think have a ton of potential and have really good fit with the values of the company, but they didn't really have the skills for what we needed, and that's really rude thing to do to them, because you're setting them up for failure, sure. Right? So the skills are important, but I think of them more as table stakes. Maybe in the same way for an employee or for someone going to work for a company, for them, a salary that's high enough is important. If the salary isn't high enough, they're probably not going to be willing or able to take the job. But that's at least for knowledge work, we're lucky enough to be in a position where usually we can choose jobs where we can do is something that feels meaningful to us. And so in the same way, for an employer, if the skills are the table stakes, we've got to have that, more or less. It's okay if there's a few gaps here and there if we identify those and we're ready to fill them in. But we also have to feel that we have great creative synergy, that when we work together, we create great things. And I do separate that a little bit from the culture fit term. Can be problematic, because sometimes that can boil down to, is it just someone I want to hang out with, which often boils down to, does that mean there's someone that's like me? And that produces a situation where, for example, if the early team is all very young people, which is pretty common, then you have a situation where that may make it harder for, say, an older person that actually could bring a lot to the team, but they don't seem to vibe quite the same way because they're from a different generation. That you do your best to try to cancel out or try to set aside. What really matters is that when you work together, you can make something great. They bring fresh ideas to the team. They bring fresh skills that can help accelerate your work, but at the same time, in a way that you share values about the things that matter, about the work that you're doing, about the mission you want to accomplish, such that you're able to work together really fluidly, rather than, I don't know, friction that's created by if one person is, for example, a hardcore Java person and you're a pure Python team. It might be hard to get along.
Sure. Then is culture a conscious effort where you sit down and you say, this is going to be our culture, write down a list of things, this is how we're going to run this company? Or is it more of a, this feels right, this is how the team works best? How does that work? How does culture in a company, especially early stage, work?
Another one of those sort of almost magic, ineffable things, but so important to get right, or at least you can point to the companies that are successful, really strong culture tends to be one element of it. For me, I think it's not something you can prescribe. It's not something you can build systematically, and it's not even worth focusing on super early on. The culture will flow naturally out of the founding team and out of the early employees that join. And at some point, you will have a culture, and it will be defined by, it will become what it is because of the people that you had. So, pick those people well. And then at some point you get to a size, maybe when you're 15 people or 25 people or some other level where you say, hey, we should actually codify some of the elements of our culture. We should write some things down in a new hire handbook, or we can do some things to do some events on the team. For example, if we're a team that really cares about design, maybe we'll take a field trip and go somewhere to a museum and look at some historic design materials. That was something we did at Heroku. You can find ways to reinforce and amplify and grow that culture that started organically. So that's important. But yeah, in the early days, it's who you are. Culture is who you are, and it just becomes part of the company based on who those individual people are.
Would you say that, so later stage, would you say it's more of a top-down approach where the executives or managers or whoever kind of instill these cultural values, or is it the other way around? I'm trying to think of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a top-down instilling. I do think that it tends to come from the people who have been there the longest, which certainly I don't know, the senior management of what we're going to call it is probably going to be part of that. But typically it's those early employees. And it's very much about, if you think of a company as a tribe, or ideally maybe as almost sort of a family, it's the people who have been around the longest that the newbies that show up are going to look to for how should I behave? What are the norms of this tribe that I've joined? And those people will do it unconsciously. They've built it over time. And so, yeah, if you're a company that's, for example, design oriented and making that really front and center, or if you're a company that's really engineering oriented and making that really front and center, they will look to those people who have been around a long time, who are cultural fixtures, and will see just how they are as people, and they will emulate that. And again, you can amplify it through certain things like handbooks or videos or onboarding process or field trips. But those are all things that ultimately are just amplifying what's already there from people. But I think there's absolutely things that sort of management or people in leadership positions can do to try to amplify the good parts of the culture and make them really apparent to new people that join, so they don't need to be flailing around trying to figure out how do I be in this group? I've joined this tribe, but I don't know what the customs are, and I don't know what the traditions are. If you can find a way to make it so that, for example, here's this new person, you're going to send them to an onboarding process where they're going to get exposure to some people who've been in the company for a long time. Maybe you buddy them up, something I've used successfully in the past, pair them up with someone, again, who's been at the company a long time, and they can just kind of shadow them for a week or two and learn the ropes that way, and learn all those little tacit things that make your culture what it is.
As far as technical side goes and having new employees come on board, how do you get them up to speed and comfortable with deploying? For example, I've heard of different companies bringing people on board and they make them deploy on the first day or the first week on the job. And that kind of shows them, it's okay if you deploy and something breaks, we can revert it back. Does that go back to the way that you set up your entire development process with the 12-factor app? Is that where you create that sense of personal growth and being comfortable with the code base and developing? Or is that more of how you mentor someone from the beginning?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think onboarding is incredibly important and often an overlooked part of the hiring process. I think of it as, once you've hired someone, you've only done half of the job. The next half of the job is helping them be successful, helping them find their place within your company where they can contribute the most. And I am, for engineers for sure, I am a strong believer in getting something deployed the first day. Whether or not they deploy it themselves, I like to give them a task that is as simple and straightforward as possible. Here's a bug fix we need. It's probably a one-line change. You're going to pair up with someone experienced, and you're going to get that change in there, and we're going to get it out, and you're going to have your name on something that is in our production system that first day. And of course, it's fun to get that win, but it's also a way to build momentum and to start learning that process. And if you are a company where, for example, the developers are just doing their own deployments all the time, which is pretty common for early stage startups, that's a great way to show them that and make them feel like they're part of that and see how it works. That might not be the right thing for all companies, but I'm certainly a fan of that approach. Anything that's going to get them involved and taking ownership and being a part of the real thing as soon as possible, as opposed to the feeling that they're off in a sandbox and not really part of the team yet. You're just delaying the time that it's going to take to get them fully up to speed.
You see your work on the live environment, and you're like, this is, I did this, I created this, I'm part of this project now. I'm not just another employee at this company. I'm actually part of the team and part of the project. Exactly.
Yeah, and that's so important. And it's easy to forget how much, when you're a new person joining the team, you're an outsider in the beginning, and you feel that, and you're excited to be a part of it, but you don't know yet how to. And anything you can do as a manager or someone who's helping new people come into the company to help them feel like they're a part of things, even in these very small ways, is, to me, that's huge. One mistake I see in that realm, a lot of new managers make, or what I consider a mistake, is take a new hire and say, oh, great, now we've got this person and we can have them go work on this side project that we've wanted to do for a long time, but we haven't been able to get around to. So it's this thing that's over here, and great, this new person, they don't have any responsibilities yet, so I can send them off to work on this thing, and they can work on this thing we haven't been able to have time to get to. Right. And in my experience, that never works, precisely for the reasons that you just said, which is now they're not feeling like they're a part of the team, right? They're off working on this project that doesn't have anything to do with what other people are doing. They're not getting exposure to the real systems. They're not working directly with the people who are in it up to their elbows, that are so loaded with responsibilities they can't do this other project. So I try to avoid that. Even if you have the goal of eventually, like the particular skills that person has makes them very well suited to work on whatever that side project is, I would much rather throw them into the main line of your development cycle, whatever that is, help them get their hands dirty for a while, and then once they feel like they're in it and they build trust with their teammates and they build working relationships and they understand the code base and they understand the tools and they understand the processes, all right, now you can think about some side project.
That makes sense. How are you on time, Adam? Got a few minutes left?
Sure, yeah, I can do a few minutes here. You might be able to hear the church tower.
I can hear it. I was wondering if that was just my imagination or not. It's not loud at all, but I could hear it in the background.
No, I moved into this place and I thought, wow, this is great. I've got this, this old, beautiful brick church right next to my apartment. What a wonderful little, piece of the European experience. And then, the first day when it started ringing like mad at 7 in the morning or whatever it is, I said, I wonder if this is such a good idea. But I've gotten used to it. I quite like it.
Speaking of getting involved with teams, and you moved from San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken, to Germany, which is a really big move. I don't even know if you knew anyone in the community or not, but you ended up getting really involved in the local startup scene, which goes back to getting involved with the team itself. How do you do that? How, even if somebody just completely moved to a completely different country, completely different city, how do you get involved? How do you find people there who are like-minded, like the same things you like, and how do you get involved in that community or startup community or tech community or whatever it is you're looking for?
Yeah, well, I had a pretty easy time of it, partially because the startup scene here is certainly very welcoming, but partially I had the calling card, I guess, of having a successful company under my belt, one in Silicon Valley, no less, which of course is the center of the world tech-wise, and that certainly made it easier for me. That said, I would imagine probably most people could show up in a city and look up meetups and look up the events that are happening and find the people on Twitter to follow and that sort of thing. And it's the nature of these networks that once you find one person, but particularly a well-connected person, you can follow that thread into, what are the co-working spaces people go to, what are the coffee shops they hang out in, that sort of thing. That said, I think probably the best way to get hooked into a local startup scene is go to work for a local startup. So if you were, and that could involve taking a job at a more established one, or it could involve trying to look for a very early stage one to join as a co-founder, or just offer your services. What can you offer, right? That's always one way to put it. So if you show up with, hey, I'm here to take from this community, that's probably going to be harder to plug in than if you show up and say, I have something to offer. I want to offer my skills. I want to offer my work to help one of the companies or one of the ventures that's going on here to succeed at their goals. And in the process of doing that, you'll probably pretty naturally get hooked into, especially a small scene, which most of them are small relative compared to San Francisco.
I live in Greenville, South Carolina, which is a really nice little city, and you can feel that it's growing, especially in the tech arena or the tech scene. You can feel that it's really starting to grow. How does, as an individual, or even on a bigger level, because this is a pretty big question, but how do you encourage this growth?
Growth of the startup scene itself?
Yeah, startup or tech scene.
I'm not sure that's something that most people have levers to affect. You could argue that government can do things to try to seed that. You can argue that established people, so investors that want to say we're going to open an office in this city, or we're going to support startup events in this city. But I think in the end, startup scenes in the end are made up of startups. So probably the best thing you could do would be to either
Mm-hmm.
start or get involved with a successful startup, because that's what's gonna
Mm-hmm.
that's what's gonna make a scene grow, right? People are you can talk about co-working spaces and coffee shops and accelerators and even investors all you want. In the end, the thing that makes the place have a
Mm-hmm.
startup scene is that it has great startups.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned also meetups where you can go and meet some like-minded people, and you could even maybe work on different projects on the side. You know, you have some interests that you've always wanted to work on, but you never really knew how to get started. When you get a group of people like that together, you can really just for fun, and then it could
Absolutely,
turn
yeah.
into a real
Probably
project.
like hackathons and that sort of thing
Mm-hmm.
have that benefit. I've been to a few events in Berlin that I quite liked that were sort of themed, not quite hackathons, but themed hack workshops. We had a few hours to work together. So I went to one that was a health tech themed, which that was basically a combination of, yeah, we did things like use heart rate monitor. We were given like
Mm-hmm.
a Raspberry Pi and like some LEDs and a thing you could wrap around your arm for a heart rate monitor, and another thing that was like a motion sensor, and then basically
Mm-hmm.
came up with, what can you build in 3 hours using these components, which included some training on how to use these specific
Mm-hmm.
devices. And I've seen other ones on all kinds of interesting kind of sub niches. Sound is, or music and sound is one that
Mm-hmm.
tends to be big around here, because you got the Spotify's and the SoundClouds and so forth in the area. And so, yeah, music specific hackathons and that kind of thing. So I think finding one of those that is a thing you think you're interested in or talented at, is probably a good way to do fun stuff and meet folks with
Mm-hmm.
similar interests.
Well, Adam, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and share your knowledge with us. Really glad we got to talk about building teams, and the founders usually get all the love. Want to spread some of the love with the teams and who put a lot of effort into it and really make a company what it is. So really appreciate your time in talking with me. How do you feel about the interview?
Well, I'll have to tell you after I go and watch it later. But I certainly appreciate the chance to talk about this stuff. Team building is certainly something I'm extremely passionate about, and so yeah, I can run my mouth on that topic all day long.
It's funny, I always miss certain details, and when I go back and watch the interview to summarize it or just to watch it a second time after I've recorded it, I'm always like, I didn't even hear that when that person said it. I didn't even register it. But that's a great point. I wish I would have evolved into that a little bit more. But yeah, thanks a lot for being here. If people want to reach out to you, how do you recommend they do that?
Twitter is probably the best way to find me, at HeroDesk, and then you can also go to my website, adamwiggins.com. My email's up there, that sort of thing.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. Please leave a comment below to thank our guest and let us know what you thought about it or what you learned about the interview. And also don't forget to follow Adam, and you can follow me at Scale Your Code on Twitter as well. So thanks a lot for watching. Hope y'all have a wonderful week, and take care.
Thanks. Happy holidays. Bye.